thought that this prayer was fitting now, as we have the results of the elections, and there may be some turmoil. So let's pray together. Most humble Saint Martin, your burning charity embraced all, especially the sick, the afflicted, and those in need. We turn to you in our present difficulties, seeking intercession. Please ask God on our behalf for this special request. And then everyone can make a special request to ask for Martin's intercession. By imitating your submission to God's will, may we have peace in our hearts. You served others without seeking anything for yourself except closeness to our crucified Lord. May we too find intimacy with Jesus through care for the needy. O God, you invited Martin de Porres into your heavenly kingdom. Grant that through his merits and by his intercession, we may follow his example. Give us the courage to address the problems that we face and the tranquility of spirit to accept as your will what cannot be changed. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ in the spirit of power and love. Amen. Just a few reminders. Next Wednesday, we don't have class. I believe this was on our original calendar. The priest of the diocese will be I think it's called a convocation, but an assembly of priests with Bishop Talley, and I'm sure it'll be about ministry, how to improve our ministry. So next week we won't have class, and then on the 18th we'll resume our classes. We won't have class the day before Thanksgiving. You should have read chapter 4 of the text, the fourth age of the church. You should be completing that reading. John Vidmar writes rather fluidly that there shouldn't be too much difficulty. It's not really dense work. We're recording the classes. I've already started the recording for today. So if you want to review the class, or if you know someone who wasn't able to attend and wants to hear the class, they can refer to the Shrine's website. You have the notes, the same notes that I use. I just sent them to you this evening. So I don't know how great a need there is to watch the video, but it's available. And of course, if you wish to make a donation to the Shrine, just go to the Shrine website, and you have been very gracious. I've received a number of donations, and they're much appreciated. Thank you. I want to take a few moments to review what we did last class by going over those dates, the significant dates in that period. We were talking mostly about the reform in the church, and we started more or less with the coronation of Charlemagne, Emperor of the German Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne had a great vision, was a great king. That's why he's Charlemagne, Charles the Great, for the people of his kingdom, which was France. Then he conquered the Lombards in Italy and became their king as well. In 909, there was a foundation of the monastery at Cluny, and this was at the beginning of a reform in monasteries. We saw how it started quite splendidly with Saint Benedict in the 5th and 6th centuries. And then there was some decadence. People left lands to the monasteries. They became rich. The monks no longer had to go out and work, and there was some corruption. The abbot, such an important role, became more a office that the nobles sought for their sons, who weren't the firstborn sons, and they were no longer the spiritual leaders of the people. So Cluny removed the control of the monastery from the local bishop and the people to the Pope. So the Pope could oversee what was going on and see that good abbots, strong, wise abbots would be appointed. And if you remember, that was one of Benedict's primary emphasis in his rule, that the abbot be strong and wise and holy. Then we talked about the reforms. I put the death of Leo IX because he was one of the great reformers in this age of reform. He was an 11th century pope who started this campaign against simony, the selling of religious offices. We already referred to that when we talked about abbots being appointed because of their families and not because of their holiness. Also, the problems, continual problem in the church having to do with sexuality. Every one of us is a sexual being, and at times the corruption or priests not honoring their vows of celibacy was a real problem. That was the way in the early Middle Ages, when many priests had, if not families, at least concubines, and Leo IX attacked that too. And then we also have a date of this great encounter, this dramatic encounter between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII, whose name is given to this reform in the 11th century, the Gregorian reform. The Pope Gregory demanded that Henry that he stop holding the offices of bishops and abbots for his personal choices, that he invests the ones give him the power, show him the symbols of power, the ring and the staff, that of the duly appointed bishop and abbot. For a while, Henry resisted, and then the Pope excommunicated him, and then he did penance coming in the snow to where the Pope was, this town in Italy, Canossa, very famous scene in church history. However, the change in Henry's behavior was very superficial, that he went back to trying to finagle his ways to get his own bishops and abbots, and the issue wasn't resolved, called the investiture controversy, until later. Then we started talking about the Crusades. The First Crusade from 1096 to 1099, how this was the only crusade to really achieve its purpose of conquering the Holy Land, of conquering Jerusalem and holding it so that pilgrims can make pilgrimages in peace. It didn't last too long, the new kingdom of Jerusalem, and in, I think, about 25 years, the Muslims retook Jerusalem, and they called the Second Crusade in 1122, or excuse me, 1145, yeah. 1198, foundation of the Cistercian Abbey in France. This was a reform. The Benedictines, as I mentioned, were not usually by this time doing work and saying their prayers. In some ways, they were involved in the intellectual life, but they were no longer living the Benedictine rules. So the first abbey in Citeaux, a Reformed abbey, was founded, and the monks had this more balanced life. And then the Cistercian abbeys were founded throughout Europe. This is the beginning of the Reform, and I mentioned last time that that reform had to be reformed in time in the 18th century, that the abbey at La Trappe in France, the Trappists as we know them, was founded. 1122, finally a concordat, an agreement among all the princes of Italy with the, of Europe with the Pope, that the princes will no longer meddle in the making of bishops and priests, that the bishops were elected by usually by the clergy at that time, and then someone from the church would invest them, give them their symbols of power. 1145, the Second Crusade was called with the help of Saint Bernard, who of Clairvaux, a Cistercian, whom we'll mention in a minute. But this crusade to go to the east to recapture this key city of Edessa, and it failed. Saint Bernard, who was one of the many churchmen who called the crusade, he died not long after. He's famous not so much for calling the crusade, but just as a theologian and preacher, was very highly regarded. I guess he also served as a kind of a spiritual director to many kings in Europe. They say he was one of the great men of the 12th century. So that's what we did last week. As we see the church always trying to reform itself, and then venturing out, trying to safeguard pilgrims to the Holy Land with the Crusades. Now, are there any questions or any comments that you want to make about the last week class or classes in the past?
Father, the First Crusade, was it successful?
Excuse me, I didn't hear the question.
The First Crusade, was it successful? Like, how did they measure?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry that I didn't make that clear. That was the only crusade that was successful in accomplishing its objective of recapturing, or excuse me, in that point, capturing Jerusalem from the Muslims and safeguarding the pilgrimages of Christians from Europe. So the First Crusade was, but none of the others were. None of the other crusades, the Holy Land, I think it's necessary to say, because the crusades, the one crusade, we're going to see this later, that was called against the Albigensians. Remember, this is that sect, that anti-materialist sect in southern France. Yeah, the Crusaders did wipe them out. I don't know how many defenders they had, but that was another kind of crusade. Okay, we'll go forward now and talk about the other crusades. We also want to talk about the High Middle Ages, this period of grandeur for not only the church, but also Europe. But let's go to the Third Crusade. Now, this is at the end of the 12th century, and Saladin, who was a great sultan, he was of Kurdish descent, but I guess, as I understand, a man very cultured, very wise ruler. He had captured, or the Muslims, and then he became ruler, had captured Jerusalem, and there was a crusade to recapture Jerusalem against this great leader. The crusade was led by the Holy Roman Empire Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the King of England, the famous Richard. I don't know if you heard the story of Robin Hood. Richard is out in a crusade, and Robin Hood is trying to protect the common people from the notorious, I think it was Prince John. Well, anyway, the story, Richard the Lionhearted is on the crusade, and also the French king, King Philip II of France. They go off to conquer the Holy Land, and they fail. Evidently, Richard made arrangements with Saladin, who was a just man, a fair man, to allow pilgrims to go to the Holy Land, but they didn't accomplish their objective of reconquering the Holy Land. But they did do some mischief. They did, mischief is not the fitting word. Evidently, there was war prisoners, 3,000 of them, that the Crusaders executed in their desire to fight the battle, and they couldn't keep the prisoners, so they just slaughtered them. Another unfortunate and we can say terrible act of war. Okay, go on to still a fourth crusade. Now, not too much later, the great Pope Innocent III called for another crusade. We're going to talk a lot about Innocent III, but he's the one who instigated this crusade, and there was a significant response by Crusaders. This time, the Crusaders decided that they would change their mode of transportation. Rather than go across land, they would go in boats, and the Venetians had the boats to transport them to the Holy Land. So they went from Italy to Constantinople, and they didn't have money. The Crusaders didn't have money to pay the Venetians their fare, their boat fare, and so they made an arrangement with the son of the emperor, the Roman emperor in Constantinople, who had been deposed and exiled, that if the Crusaders could restore this prince's father to be emperor, they would be paid from the royal treasury. So they did restore the emperor, but it was found out that there wasn't any money to pay the Crusaders, and the Crusaders sacked the city, brought many of the treasures of the city of Constantinople back to Europe, and they installed one of their own as the ruler, or I'm not sure if he took the title of emperor, but he would be the highest ruler in Constantinople. After that, there wasn't much interest in going on to Jerusalem to recapture the Holy Land. And so there was a Latin king in Constantinople, and I think they deposed the patriarch of Constantinople and put a Latin bishop as the bishop or the patriarch of Constantinople. So what happened as a result was, instead of improving relations between the Eastern Emperor and the Western leaders, it strained relationships. The relationship between the Orthodox and the Catholics, which was, it was hoped that they would improve because of this help that the Catholic Crusaders were giving the Eastern, the Orthodox emperor, those relations were set apart so much that there was going to be no healing soon between those relationships. We're going to see how there was an attempt in the 15th century especially to bring the two, we can say this is St. John Paul's second term, the two lungs of the church back together, but how that ultimately failed. What I'm saying now is that with this insult that the Crusaders perpetuated against the Orthodox in Constantinople, the relationships between the two churches or two parts of the church were hopelessly hopelessly strained, and there wasn't going to be any healing soon. Okay, so those are the four primary crusades, but there were other crusades. There was a fifth crusade that was called by Innocent III at the Fourth Lateran Council. This is a council that we're going to talk about later. And it tried to take over Jerusalem, but was failed. Now, this was not going through Constantinople, this crusade, rather was going through Egypt. And the Crusaders met superior forces of the Sultan Al-Malik al-Kamel. And here we have the famous encounter between St. Francis, who went along on the crusade, not to fight, but I'm sure to give spiritual support to the Crusaders, and the Sultan. I don't know if you know the story. It's quite interesting that that Francis went out and asked to see the Sultan. The Sultan permitted him to come into the presence, and then they talked. And Francis challenged the Sultan, kind of a duel. If the Sultan wanted Francis to walk across a cross, and Francis did it, saying that there were 3 crosses on Calvary, and he walked across the cross of one of the thieves on Calvary. And then the Sultan challenged Francis to walk across burning coals. And Francis did that. He walked across the burning coals, and he asked the Sultan if he would convert to Christianity after he had done this great feat of walking across burning coals. And the Sultan said no. If he converted to Christianity, his people would kill him and Francis. So he let Francis go back to the Christian side, and ultimately defeated the Fifth Crusade. The Sixth Crusade saw Jerusalem temporarily in the French hands. There was a short time where the French controlled Jerusalem, but it was finally crushed in a counterattack, and that failed its objectives. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades are put together here because they were led by the great French king, Saint Louis IX, and they didn't accomplish their objectives. As a matter of fact, in the Eighth Crusade, during the Eighth Crusade, Louis died. A Ninth Crusade, spearheaded by the Prince Edward of England, he managed to secure a truce with Jerusalem, but then rather than stay there and to make sure that the truce was kept, he went back to England, and the pilgrims were in the same situation of at the mercy of the Muslims once again. Now, there were other crusades. I think they count 12 in all, but in any case, there was a crusade against the Albigensians. This one was also convoked by Pope Innocent III, forcing the Albigensians, this anti-materialist sect, the leaders. Innocent spoke of this as against the leaders. He thought that the people would be convinced by the preaching of first the Cistercians and then the Dominicans and Franciscans, but the leaders, kind of the hardcore Albigensians, they needed to be persecuted physically. And so he called the crusade. And in this sense, this crusade was successful. By the 1229, evidently there wasn't any resistance to Catholicism on the part of the Albigensians. The Albigensians, or the Cathars, sometimes they're called the Cathars, which means, that's the word that means pure, and because they had this idea of living spiritually and not physically, and it really got to be extreme, and it certainly defied our belief, Judeo-Christian belief in the goodness of creation. There was in the middle 1200s, there was a crusade called against the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II, who was a bit of a mischief maker for the popes. So the popes called a crusade against him. But then you have the sense of it becoming, losing its sense. The crusade to save the lands that where Christ lived became a way to solve all of the problems of the popes of the church at the time. I want to go into an evaluation and say some of the results of the crusade and give an evaluation as well. First, we'll talk some about the spiritual results of the crusade. The Crusades had a biblical precedent, with the ones who called the crusade talked about Joshua's invading the land of Canaan in the city of Jericho. And here it was a crusade called to capture the Holy Lands, to make it safe for pilgrims to keep this land where Christ lived as a place that was in Christian hands. So we have this biblical precedent for the Crusades, the Crusades were calling the knights in Europe to come and to do, if not a charitable work, a kind of quasi-spiritual work. They would be fighting not for their own glory, not for money or riches. They would be fighting for the Lord. And the church promised them, as it has the authority to do, spiritual recompense. They would be given indulgences for their participation in these wars, and even the indulgences to take care of the temporal effects of their sins. They can always have their sins forgiven by confession, but the temporal, as we say, the temporal debt of their sins has to be repaid, and this is what one of the reasons that the theologians theorize on purgatory as a way where this debt is paid for our sins, where we pay the debt of our own sins, and that's the Crusades offered indulgences so that the debt might be relieved. One of the results of the Crusades was the forming of these semi-religious military communities. It was a great phenomenon that took place. The knights came together and they formed kind of like a holy army. Of course, the Crusades itself, but now I'm talking about say a holy battalion. And some of these holy battalions are known to us. I mean, we're familiar with them. The Knights Templars, for example, protected the pilgrims on their way. That was their goal, their reason for being, to protect the pilgrims. And after the Crusades, the Knights Templars returned to France. They became a kind of mercenary force, gave the king, I think Philip IV, lots of trouble, and Philip just squanched them, and they went out of existence. Remember the Knights Templar in the Da Vinci Code? They've always kind of attracted the interest of historians and pseudo-historians. So we have that. We heard of the Knights Templar in that book and movie, and here it was formed during the Crusades. These knights, semi-religious military organizations, a more successful one, we can say, is the Knights Hospitallers, and they ministered to the sick in the city of Jerusalem, pilgrims and other sick people. I suppose the knights had people working for them, and then they provided the physical means to make the hospitals worked. And so the knights, after the Crusades, they went to Malta and they became a kind of force in Malta. And eventually these knights, I mean soldiers, became what we know today as the Knights of Malta, which have a special purpose in the Holy Lands. They provide money to keep the Christian presence in the Holy Land. Many of our wealthy Catholics belong to the Knights of Malta. It's a semi-fraternal organization. Again, their purpose is more of a to help the Holy Land, and it's also this great social organization, club, if you wish, but it really is more. They do have a of spiritual purpose and a spirituality. Another group, semi-religious military commanders, was the Teutonic Order in Germany, and evidently that still exists today. I'm not sure if they still bear arms. I suspect that there's something like our Knights of Columbus. They have some symbolic weapons, and it's more of a fraternal organization, but I'm not sure. And yet I know that the Teutonic Order still exists today. So these were kinds of outcomes of the Crusades that have had some value, and not maybe it doesn't justify the Crusades, but we can see the spiritual value of these order of knights. And just perhaps to say that the knights, rather than fighting wars were meeting real needs of the people in the Holy Land and then back into Europe. The crusade had religious objectives and were not exclusively called against the Muslims. It wasn't just out of hatred for the Muslims that we had crusades, but of course they were called to enable Christian pilgrims to go to the Holy Land.
Excuse me, Father.
Sure.
There were times when I remember reading that the Muslims were getting along quite well with the population, and so I wonder how they got people stirred up against them.
Would you please repeat the question?
That's okay. It's too much echo.
No, please. I just didn't hear it. I was
okay. The Muslims got along quite well with the population, and when the fight started with the Crusades, I don't know why they attacked. I don't know where the hatred came from.
Now I'm not really all that conversant with the times. I've read and I do believe that Muslims at different points in history were very sophisticated people, on par with Western sophistication. And we're going to, you read in your book something that's very interesting. We'll come to that in just a few minutes. But at different points in history, they weren't so defensive, and then as a matter of being defensive, offensive, doing some of these extreme acts which have taken place very recently, but I'm thinking of the murders in Vienna just the other day, and then a week ago or so ago in France, and of course 9/11. So they didn't resort to that. They were a kind of a distinguished power at different points in history. But I'm sure, and I know this because I think it was in John Vidmar's book where he talks about the Muslims always being kind of oppressive to Christians wherever they had control of Christians. Now, if we get to it today, we're going to talk about some Christians not being very, if you will, Christian to Jews and Muslims. But there has been this lack of equality for Christians in Muslim societies with a majority of Muslim. Perhaps that there's reciprocation of that, as we're going to see. But I get the idea in my reading that the Muslims were always more oppressive than their Christian counterparts.
Thank you. That was my question.
Just some changes on the political landscape. The Crusades solidified Europe. They were no longer tribes fighting one another. The Crusaders came from different national groups, and they formed a kind of European identity, which is positive. One of the reasons for calling the Crusades was that so the European nations would not fight one another, but would join together and do something good for the pilgrims in the Holy Land, and that effect was realized. But at the same time, in creating a united front in Europe, the Crusades were also responsible for the deterioration of relations between the Eastern Empire and Europe, the old Western Empire, as we saw with the Fourth Crusade. And then, of course, the very strained relationship with Muslims, kind of creating enmity among the Muslims because of the massacre in the First Crusade, and we mentioned of a mass execution in the Third Crusade. So to some extent, and I've heard this debated in different ways, to some extent, the Muslims remember the harshness of the Crusaders and resent it. And of course, to repeat, what I think was a very noble act on the part of St. John Paul II at the beginning of the third millennium. He asked pardon for the atrocities done to Muslims by Crusaders, by the Christian forces. And some social, what I call social aspects, social results. The Crusades facilitated the interchange between East and West, not only commerce, but also learning. So the West learned some things from the East, and they imparted some of their knowledge to the East, to the Muslims. Now, it's very interesting. Our author, Father John Vidmar, says that the Crusaders brought back to Europe an increased respect for women. He says that prior to the Crusades, women were very harshly treated. Again, the idea of being just chattel, as they say, just like a farm animal. And then because of what the Crusaders saw, how the Crusaders saw the Muslims respecting their women, their wives, they returned, and there was a greater respect for women in Europe. Now, I don't know where Father Vidmar gets these ideas. I'm sure he can document what he's saying, but I haven't read that from any other author besides our textbook. And then he says, Vidmar says, how this increased respect for women catalyzed Marian devotion, that after the Crusades, more and more churches were dedicated to the Blessed Mother. And also, he said that rosary was a devotion that initiated at the time of the Crusades, precisely because of this enhanced devotion to the Blessed Mother that was indirectly brought about by the Crusades. So there's some very interesting social aspects of the Crusades' improvement. Say advancements, say development. Of course, the Crusades have had an ambiguous legacy. They are both emulated and disparaged in our time. I think many sports teams are named Crusaders because they see the Crusaders as a righteous, strong force. And yet, some political figures, whether they're just kind of being revisionist and wanting to criticize the church, they have talked about the atrocities caused by Crusaders in the East. perhaps both of these images, Crusaders being a righteous force and Crusaders being a malicious army, needs further investigation and reflection. Okay, now I would like to take a little time out and ask you to reflect a little bit, write some answers down, and we can talk about these answers. If you want to answer aloud, okay, just unmute your microphone and say what's on your mind. Many, I'll give the question. Many criticize the church for calling to crusades, but not the Gulf War, which was a kind of crusade for the nations of the world to reverse Saddam Hussein's aggression in Kuwait. I think I wrote that question too fast, but anyway, you get the idea. People have criticized the crusades, but they are not likely to criticize what turned out to be a kind of crusade, the calling of the First Gulf War, where people, soldiers from around the world went to the Kuwait to liberate Kuwait. And what's interesting to me is one of the only opponents of that First Gulf War was precisely the Pope. John Paul II thought it was a bad idea and didn't want it to happen. You know, he asked the nations, the Western nations, not to pursue that military conquest. Now, he probably thought more political, peaceful dialogue would have resolved the problems. So what is your sense of a holy, or the other thing is in the last, say, 5 years, there has been this other kind of group, nations wanting to strategize together to free Iraq and Syria from the challenge of ISIS, this Islamic state that in very short time took over a large part of Iraq and parts of Syria as well. And there's a sense in the Western nations that they had to help the Christians and other peoples in those countries. So I ask the questions. What is your sense of a holy war? How might excesses be avoided if a nation chooses to enter one? And then we can ask at the same time the second group of questions. What are some of the positive outcomes and some of the negative outcomes of the Crusades in your mind? Was the church wrong in calling them? I'd like you to think just for a couple of minutes and then write your answers, or as I say, you can say them aloud if you wish.
Father Carmen.
David, yep.
Summer question. They apparently no diplomatic action was taken before the First Crusade was launched. And
you're talking about in the 12th century, the last years of the 12th century?
Yes.
Okay.
And the goal was noble, to free the Holy Land from interference of pilgrims and tourists and maybe even the local people that were not or didn't want to practice the Muslim faith. But I wonder how they got word of there was so much trouble. Still there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I had a phone call intercept something, but that's okay. I'll take it later. And so, although St. Francis attempted some based on what you revealed earlier, and there didn't appear to be a local joining. Once the Crusaders from Europe got there didn't seem to be they didn't seem enough locals to join the uprising. That seems to be neglected in some of the history telling of it. And it looks like the Muslims, an economic deal could have been cut. You know, if the Muslims could have been persuaded that if they didn't interfere with the pilgrims, or they could benefit from the trade and economic impact from all the visitors from the, not only Europe, but other places. So then I recall on the President George W. Bush, his council of leaders wisely convinced him to drop the term Crusaders. And
okay, I didn't remember that, but that was dropped. He probably did use the term in the beginning, but okay, good.
Right, he used it innocently, I would think, but I think it was, wiser to drop it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And on the Kuwait situation, I remember what kind of surprised, if not disturbed me, was the Kuwaitis, men of military age. Some of them fled to England and Europe, and they didn't stay and fight for their land. And originally, Iraq was rationalizing it by saying Kuwait was drilling at an angle to extract some of their oil. And we had a similar problem for water. The state of Mississippi has accused the West Tennessee drillers of our great aqueduct we've been blessed with of using it in terms of getting water that would belong in the state of Mississippi. It's all one basin, but
yeah, I know the question.
Economic jealousy, you might say.
Yeah.
So it's always easier to judge it in today's context versus what the context was, years and centuries ago. So we always have to be cautious of that. And the women thing that he mentioned, maybe it was because they weren't treating them like chattel, but there was some control, and maybe if they had such dress codes and how they could associate, maybe they did that because they wanted to keep them honored and didn't want other men to dishonor them.
Okay, now you're talking about the Muslims, or you're talking about the European?
The Muslims. When Father, he mentioned that, I was surprised too that it brought back influenced the respect for women when the participants of the Crusades went back to Europe.
Yeah.
And it's my understanding, I'll close on that one, that the Muslims also venerate Mary as a virgin and I think our catechism and Vatican documents have recognized they have high regard for her.
Right.
Even though they shun from an incarnation theology. I've had Muslim acquaintances that said they think Ishmael was sacrificed rather than Isaac on the holy mountain, and so those kind of issues arise. And Iran has never attacked a country in over 250 years. The tragic, long-lasting Iraq-Iran war lasted nearly a decade, was initiated by Iraq. So they were put in a defensive situation, and the U.S. trying to play neutral and support both sides. They didn't want either one to become dominant after a war victory. So those are just some morsels of food for thought.
Okay, yeah, other things to think about. How about the question though? You think that there is valid reasons for holy wars, and how might damage be limited?
You asking me?
No, I ask you, yes, but anyone could answer. I have a couple of written answers. Think all of you see them. Do you want to try to answer that, David?
Maybe in hindsight, we shouldn't use the word holy, but, maybe, a rescue for, freedom of pilgrims to live and operate in that land. I mean, I didn't get any impression that the pilgrims were abusing anybody once they were there, or tried to take over anything, or and then you had I don't know how much communication they were able to do, the Christians that were already there and the bishops communicating to their parallel in Europe. So I would refrain from calling it a holy war. And
okay, let me go on and look at one of them. Someone says holy war is an oxymoron. Matthew, you want to say why you call it an oxymoron, and may tell us what an oxymoron is too.
Well, I just feel like when we're called to holiness, we are called to love God and love our neighbor, and through prayer to be united with God. And I think war is the total opposite of killing our neighbors, and I think it does a lot to our own self. And so I'm saying that it's like two opposite things.
Okay, would a war ever be justified? Can it ever be a good thing to go to war? This is the why I think it's called a holy war, and maybe it's because it has something to do with the church. But we're asking if it could ever be good to go to war, and I hear you kind of saying no. But if we think about it, think about it. What about defenseless people who are being abused, mistreated, violated, killed?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer. I think there's other options. I don't know. I guess I try to be someone who believes not in war. I don't know if I'm a pacifist, if that's what you call me, but yeah, I know, like World War II, there's all kinds of, which is a very good thing that we were standing up for those people that were being killed, the Jews, and Hitler. So, yeah, I think I don't have an answer for you.
Okay. No, it's a very difficult question. I think the main part of the Christian tradition would say yes, there is such a thing as a just war. But then some people say there may be a just war, but the wars that we fought have never really been truly just. And they would say, the atrocities committed against civilians during just about every war. Evidently, during the Middle Ages now, the soldiers were much more protective of people. I talked about the First Crusade, the flowing of the Muslim blood, they say it was knee deep in the mosque of Jerusalem. But generally, they say during the Middle Ages, the soldiers fought, and not always on Sunday, by the way, and that the civilians were left in peace. Okay, I'm going to just see a couple more of these answers. Carmen had says it is very hard question to answer. The age-old question, is war ever justified? In my opinion, it is yes. She takes a stand. If a holy war is necessary, would it have been used when we are considering church reunification? Carmen, you want to explain what you mean by that question? I'm not sure.
Hi. Well, what I was thinking when we talked about church reunification during the First Crusade, and the Eastern Orthodox, I think they were trying, when you speak of holy war, I always consider that as trying to bring the church back together, a church reunification when there was such division during the First Crusade, although I could be off the mark on that one, but
No, you're right. There was at least as I understand it, there was this general sense that the Crusades might bring the church back together. Not only the first one, but all of them. So they did it, partially for that reason. Go ahead.
So that's what I was thinking when we speak of a holy war, when it revolves or when we're considering how it affects the church. But now, is a war ever justified? Like I said in my answer, I do believe that it is. When you look back through history and from the beginning of time, there's always been war. And it's not to eradicate the human race, but just to bring back civility and peace. And sometimes you have to have war and before you can have peace. I've been listening to the history of Stalin and Nazi Germany and all of that. And when Great Britain finally entered into the war, and then we entered into the war, you had to, in order to eradicate that evil that was going on. And while there were so many lives lost, there was victory at the end. So while we might not understand why these wars happen, and true enough, there have been some that there was no need. The Vietnam War, you can go down a list of wars that truly were not necessary. But when you think of those that were, when you think about the human atrocities and the degradation of other humans, you have to step in at some point to eradicate that evil and bring about a world of peace and justice. But, like I said, that's just my opinion.
Okay, no, thank you. And I think all of us, I think most of us would agree with you that war is sometimes necessary to ensure the good and to defeat evil. And there are evil deeds done, and people are terribly oppressed by different powers. Usually it's minorities in a land. Did God tell us to go to war like the Jews in the Old Testament? We're not. An interesting question. We have to remember that the history in the Old Testament was written many years after the events took place, and it may not have occurred exactly the way it is written. Is God telling us to go to war? At times, perhaps the discernment of the good people, the just people, the prudent people say, yes, it's time to go to war. We can see this as a way of God telling us. We don't expect to see divine revelations taking place, on a mountaintop. But we have to remember also, and this I think is critical, that Jesus was the fullness of God's revelation to us, and he seemed to be very pacifist. If the enemy approaches you and strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other cheek. We have to keep this in mind as we try to discern whether wars are justified. Okay, The Sultan and the Saint was a PBS documentary. This is the thing between St. Francis and Sultan Amalek Kamel, and maybe seen on PBS Prime, I guess is Amazon Prime. Not to get on a tangent, but Jesus on the Mount is pretty clear. Good, yes, it is, and we have to keep that in mind as we talk about war and defending innocent. It's a very difficult question, and we have to pray for our political government leaders that they make good decisions when war seems to be looming, seems to be near. Okay, Beating Guns Hope for Those Who Are Weary of Violence by Shane Claiborne is a great book. Okay, so this is not too much. I'm done. Okay, thank you, Matthew. All right, let's go on. I think I have people who wrote answers, and talk about our next topic, which we're going to get into the High Middle Ages. And this is 1100 to 1300. We actually have been covering some of the High Middle Ages, 1100s, with all of the Crusades fought then. But we want to talk more about the cultural aspects and the religious aspects of these times. And it's quite an interesting time. There you have the picture of St. Francis, who was had this vision that he would be rebuilding the church, and he started to refurbish, to rebuild this church outside of Assisi. And when they talk about holding up the church, rebuilding the church, they had something much greater in mind than to repair the church in Assisi. But let's get on with the story. This is the 12th and 13th century, and times were changing. Well, things always change in time, but there were some very significant changes. The trade with the East, because of the Crusades, established more need of a merchant class. People wanted, I think one of the treasures they brought back from the East was sugar, and people wanted this, so they engaged in trade, what they could trade for the sugar and the spices in the East. Because of this trade, the economy was less a barter system than we can say a capitalist system. The banks, I think especially in Italy, I think they for a good extent were the banking system that we have today was started in Italy at this time. But anyway, the money was used to make trades. This is kind of interesting, and I didn't see this in John Vidmar's book, but I heard this in an unrelated way, that during, and then I checked this out, by the way, this is certain. During the 11th and 12th century, there was experience of global warming, where actually the average temperature increased by a number of degrees. And one of the reasons people give for saying this, what a difference it made, is that Greenland, this tremendous island that we have in the Arctic area, was actually green at that time, and not a rocky, plantless place that it has been. I don't know if in recent years they've started to, because of the global warming we've experienced in our time, where they have a lot of natural plants there in Greenland. But anyway, during this time, Greenland was evidently green. This was the time of the Norwegian exploration of Iceland and Vinland, and coming to North America, enabled because of these warmer temperatures. But even more than that, Europe was warmer and was able to have longer growing seasons, which produced more crops, which gave more food, which enabled more people to be free from the hard work on the land, and to give some time to more time to education and to making a greater culture. So the global warming during these centuries had some very dramatic effects. The people were being drawn to the cities because of this greater commerce. This had some positive effects, but also some negative effects. People brought in the city to the cities, brought out the great disparity between the classes, the rich and the poor, and the poor, living in ghettos in the city suffered. They didn't have their gardens like they had on the farm, and they were living in misery. But bringing people together does create more trade and improve conditions, just more money being circulated. At this time, there were guilds, which are kind of like labor unions. That actually, they were more of a fraternal organizations among the guilds people. Sure, they were able to work out ways to protect themselves and their families from exploitation, but they also serve these guilds as fraternal organizations. They help the guild members if something happened to one, but also to help the poor, that they felt a mission. Say the Shoe Cobblers Guild might have, and this is just a hypothetical. I don't have anything. I haven't read this in any book, but the shoe cobblers may have had a guild that took care of the aged people who lived alone, and just to say, they did charitable acts. So the guilds at the time had a very positive effect, and also the members of the guild would participate in religious processions, religious activity as a guild. So lots of activity, church activity, brought about by this increasing commercial society.
Excuse me, Father.
Now, yes, Cindy.
Do you
Please.
recall teaching that there was the poor and then there was the miserable? Can you repeat that a little?
Okay. This is a way of understanding. You know, they're all people living from day to day. They may be the poor, but the miserable have a hard time surviving. They have to go out and beg. They don't have a way to produce what they need or to buy what they need from their own work. So it's one thing to be poor, to live simply, but quite another thing to be miserable and to just kind of scrounging in order to get by. Okay. All right, just one of the great figures of this era, and he actually what's the word I want? Both sides of the, he lived in the 12th and the 13th century, straddled the two centuries, is Innocent III. In any list of great popes, you'll see Innocent III. Now, I don't know if he ever had a cause for sainthood, but he was never declared a saint. And yet he had a great vision for the church and evidently ruled with a lot of wisdom, governed with a lot of wisdom. He was well prepared for being elected pope, and he was elected pope when he was only 37 years old, but he had studied in Paris theology and canon law. He had a sense of the papacy, and this is not original with him, but the papacy as being kind of the supreme ruler of the world. Now, the papacy, he might have had an army because the Pope did have these papal states, but he needed the armies of the other nations in order to carry out his vision, his commands. But he was the one with the supreme power, and being a person of great ability, he was able to bring the leaders of the nations along with him to do the work that was necessary so that his ideas could become reality. It is said that he was like the spiritual director of all the kings of Europe. He said himself that he was a little lower than God, but above men. That's what, in Innocent's mind, what the Pope was, kind of God's a viceroy in the world. At this time, the idea of Christendom, this marriage between church and state, reached its height, again, through the political ability of Innocent III. The Holy Roman Empire would see that the popes are elected fairly, and then the popes would crown the Holy Roman Emperor, giving them the authorization to rule over Europe. Now, the truth is that the King of France, the King of England, they didn't see the Holy Roman Emperor as their sovereign. They were the leaders in their own lands. But during Innocent's time, there was relatively, we can say, complete peace in Europe. And throughout the 13th century, there was, for a good extent, peace in Europe. And war wasn't this great menace to development of peoples. Innocent called the Fourth Vatican Council. Now we're going to see how there were many councils during these 2 centuries, but the Fourth Lateran Council was the most significant. Lots of reform being called for. One reform, for example, that affected the Dominican order was that there were lots of new congregations, groups of religious being formed. They said, no more new orders. You can't come up with a new plan anymore. If you're going to start a new order, the new group, the new order had to be based on on one of the plans, one of the constitutions that were already in existence. So the Dominicans, who formed just at the time of the Vatican Council, used the Augustinian constitution. It was St. Augustine had developed this constitution, and we took that rather than our new constitution. Now, excuse me, I use the word constitution and I mean rule, because in 1221, the Dominicans did write a constitution, but the basic rule was the one of Augustine. If I can say, I forget what all that is in that rule. It doesn't really matter, just to say that the Lateran Council was a reform, and it did affect religious life. I want to talk more about the Lateran Council later, but just another aspect of Innocent III's papacy was the Albigensian heretics. Now, we've talked about them before, or the Cathars, as they were called, or I think they called themselves. Albigensian just means the people are around the city of Albi in southern France. They were purists. They were people who thought that there was something wrong with material creation. It was corrupt, and it was corrupting. And of course, again, this was anti-evangelical, and that had to be corrected, those ideas. And Innocent III first had the Cistercians go and to try to convince the Cathars that they were wrong. And then he formed the Mendicant orders, which we're going to talk about in a little bit of depth, so that they would go and preach to the people. And they were more successful than the Cistercians because they had a more simple lifestyle. Okay. Now let's go into the Mendicant orders. They were founded at the time of Innocent. Actually, Innocent III did approve the Franciscan order. I believe the year is 1209. Francis wanted authorization to form his disciples into a religious group. And then in 1216, the year after the Lateran Council, just after Innocent III died, the Dominicans were given their authorization from Innocent's successor, Honorius. I think it's Honorius the third as well. And both of them had a sense of poverty, that they would go out and beg for their food. And this is where the word mendicant comes from, a Latin word meaning to bend, mendigar. They would live so simply that they would impress the Cathars, and I didn't mention it before, but the Valdensians, or Waldensians, in mostly in northern Italy, and perhaps in France as well. This other group, not quite as radical as the Cathars, but the same idea, anti-materialist. With both groups, the Franciscans and Dominicans leading simple lives, but always affirming the goodness of creation, were able to impress some of the Cathars and Waldensians to give up their idea that the material order was always wrong. Franciscans, founded by Francis. Francis had this vision that he would be holding up the church, and what that meant, of course, that his order would preach and teach the people of Europe, bring them to a deeper faith, a greater faith. Francis, of course, is famous for saying the only constitution that our disciples need, our Franciscans need, is the Gospels. There's no need for a written constitution. Dominic was more organized than Francis. He didn't have half the charisma, I would say, as Francis, but he knew what he was doing and he did it well. Dominic saw this error, this theological error of the Cathars in southern France when he was on a mission with a bishop in Spain, and he went back to southern France and draw some disciples around him, and then in 1216 sent this community of disciples that he had throughout Europe, 2 by 2, England, France, Poland, I believe, Spain, Italy, and founded the orders. Francis had this radical vision of poverty, which I believe Dominic shared, but maybe not quite to the same extent, where Dominic was more interested in having his friars learn it. He formed the Order of Preachers. The Dominicans are the Order of Preachers, and he wanted people who knew what they were talking about. So he sent friars to, especially to the great university cities, and we're going to look more into that. It'll be next time, but how these university cities were formed. Dominic sent them there to get the theological education, and then the Dominicans became the great inquisitors, judging if people were heretics or not because of their refined knowledge of theology. Okay, but they weren't the only friars. We say, well, where do we get this word friars? Huh? It sounds funny to some people. The word is just a, in our case, is an Anglicization of the Latin word frater, which means brother. They were there was an equality among the members of the two in the same order. In Dominican's case, the prior, as we say, just means the first. Prior is, it means this idea of the one that goes before, is the first among equals. The Franciscans use the word guardian for their leaders, but in the same way, they were all brothers together. The Dominicans were founded as a clerical order. Dominic intended that his men were ordained priests. Now, early on, they accepted men who would just work providing the physical needs of the priest. And they were accepted into the order as brothers, but it is fundamentally a clerical order, where Franciscans were not a clerical order. St. Francis himself was never ordained a priest. He was a deacon, but you don't have the same emphasis on preparing people to minister by preparing them for the priesthood. Okay, and the last thing just to mention, these are not the only mendicant orders that were founded in the 13th century. Also at this time later, but during the same 13th century, we have the Carmelites, the Augustinians, and the Servites. Basically the same type of idea. People living, men living very simply and going out and doing their ministerial work, whether it be teaching or preaching or helping the poor. Okay, well, it's 8:31 and it's time to let go for now. Again, next week I have to, I'll be at the priest assembly, and so we won't have class. God willing, we'll meet on the 18th and finish our discussion of the Middle Ages and perhaps go into this great transition century, the 14th century. But that's for 2 weeks from now. Any questions, comments before I go?
Father Carmen.
Yeah.
David,
yeah.
You refresh me on the next event. We had Father Bruce the other weekend, and
I'll be happy to. We're going to have a very well-educated Franciscan, the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky. He will speak twice, once on Tuesday night, December 1st, and then Wednesday afternoon, December 2nd, at your alma mater, or at least where you went for the degree in Catholic Studies, at CBU. He'll speak on Tuesday evening on Pope Francis, the Amazon, and he wants to include Fratelli Tutti, this latest encyclical of Francis. He's a personal friend. We live together in El Paso, and he has this great love of both the Franciscan order and St. Francis. So I'm sure it'll be worth attending. And then on Wednesday, he's going to lead a conversation on racism. So he'll be insightful and inspiring. Well worth the time to either go there or, if you wish, to view it online. And I'll have more information on that when I get it from CBU.
His last name again was?
Stowe, S-T-O-W-E.
Okay, that rings a bell now. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Good night, everyone.
Take care. Have a great
Good
retreat
night, Father.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night, Father. Thank you.
Good night, Father.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for listening.